Nirvana's MTV Unplugged is largely considered the singular masterpiece of the program's history. Nowadays, the merits of acoustic musical interpolations are largely missed or mocked, and indeed, many of the episodes were superfluous and only done because eventually it was just what one did, the equivalent of a Tiny Desk concert. But the show had many brilliant performances in the early to mid-90s. When depressed hard rock was the popular musical genre, it made sense to show off its actual depths by turning off the distortion and letting you hear the lyrics. Not to mention letting the boomers hear the Dylan of it all, and forcing them to admit it was more than just loud, mumbling teenagers, and miles beyond the hair metal it had annihilated. Acoustic Whitesnake? Try to imagine it without laughing. Despite stellar entries from Stone Temple Pilots, Live, Alice in Chains, The Cranberries, Pearl Jam, and more, only one episode ever got the kudos the show was trying to earn Gen X's music: Nirvana. It had the emotional advantage of being released posthumously, so we hung extra weight on it in hindsight. It also has the advantage of starring the most popular and well-reviewed of the so-called grunge bands in general, so it was easier to admit it was amazing. But there really is something different about that performance, something apparent by the end as Kurt wails the last lines to Where Did You Sleep Last Night? Something bold, electric, and solitary. Kurt, it is thought, probably had already made the decision to leave. More than that, though, it's something else. The covers Kurt chose to do were neither to serve fans nor to demonstrate musical literacy to critics. It begins with About a Girl, flows into The Man Who Sold the World and Lake of Fire, and ends with Where Did You Sleep Last Night? The tracks tell a story, one that culminates in the emotional crux of it all. Nirvana's Unplugged is the real suicide note. True Neutral's mission is to point out the third perspectives, ones not born of identity, analysis, or logic, but instead supported by empathy, observation, and reason. We're here to ask the tough questions, to force society to embrace its shadow. You may think the tough questions about Nirvana have been asked, but there's one we've refused to ask ourselves. The question we're most afraid of. The question, therefore, that we must ask. What if Courtney Love isn't a liar? We like to believe a killer self-destructs, that upon a murder, even a justifiable one, guilt will swallow them and whole. There's an obvious comfort to this idea that justice is served, if not by the system, then by life or God or our innate humanity. It's possible, of course. A psychologically healthy person would indeed be rent asunder by the guilt of such a horrible act. These people, however, tend to not commit murder. Negligent homicide? Sure. Accidental death? Sure. Self-defense? Absolutely. But calculated, cold-blooded murder? That takes very specific disturbances. In current DSM-5 language, what we used to call sociopathology, psychopathology, and malignant narcissism have largely been lumped together into antisocial personality disorder and narcissism. In clinical diagnosis and treatment, it is useful to see all of these as of a piece. In criminology, however, the old categories linger because profiling requires designations diagnoses do not. In the DSM-5's alternative personality disorder model, the 10 major personality disorders are arranged into 3 symptom clusters. Cluster A is the eccentric cluster, paranoid, distrustful, schizoid or detached with restricted affect, and schizotypal or odd behavior with cognitive distortions. B is the dramatic cluster, antisocial or disregarding of others' rights, borderline or unstable with unpredictable relationships and affects, histrionic or attention-seeking with emotional flooding, and narcissistic or lacking in empathy. Cluster C is anxious, avoidant or having a social inhibition and sensitivity to negative feedback, dependent or a submissive need to be taken care of, and obsessive-compulsive or the need to control with extreme perfectionism. These can all overlap. The new model is not about categories, but about locating the patient's symptoms on a map of symptom clusters. Still, there are specifics that can be said about each cluster. Narcissists, for instance, tend to raise borderlines, and borderlines tend to raise anxiety disorders. Within Cluster B, borderlines and narcissists are drawn together in a relationship commonly referred to as folie à deux, or the folly of two. This relationship leads to a flurry of self-destruction, which the sociopath reinforces the psychopath's worst tendencies and in return receives affection for their performance. Either may be non-violent on their own, but together the mirroring and positive feedback loop can lead very quickly to a violent escalation. In the C cluster, a similar self-perpetuating cycle might be the obsessive-compulsive personality that requires constant control and perfection, paired with a submissive that needs someone to do everything for them. This, too, would not be sustainable. Finally, the codependent relationship of two anxious individuals is the least dangerous but most common form of the same type of relationship. Their mercurial mood swings set off each other's fears of rejection and perception of extreme love, but their experience with their parents and their own instability can allow them to navigate one another's when they are in opposite spaces, giving a false sense that they have a handle on each other's disorders. But when they align into manic or depressive episodes of two people at the same time, it can quickly descend into a lesser folly. I was 13 when Kurt Cobain killed himself. I'd like to say I'd been into Nirvana, grunge, or indeed music at all leading up to it, but I hadn't been. Actually, I don't know why I'd like to have said that. That's macabre as hell. Either way, I didn't discover Nirvana till later. I thought I didn't like music at all until a month prior to Kurt's passing, upon hearing the soundtrack to the second great comic book movie, Alex Proyas' version of James O'Barr's The Crow. The first was Superman 2. When I finally started paying attention and finally saw the Smells Like Teen Spirit video, Kurt was already a ghost. Distant, abstract, another generation's martyr. I mourned that I'd never experienced it live in all the definitions of that term, but I never experienced the cult of personality my younger uncles and cousins had. I just knew that from the moment that video began for me, the silent scream inside me that had been building with the saccharine, corporate manufactured gloss that dominated the 80s, that said nothing about my personal experience, had found its way to Kurt's mouth and denormalized all that dishonesty in an instant. Because I did not experience Nirvana till after, I experienced Hole at the same time rather than later. Kurt's death, the MTV Unplugged performance, Live Through This, Nevermind, and In Utero for me are inseparable experiences, stanzas of a single tragic poem that happened to me all at once in May of 1994. It began with the distraught, gruff, open sore that was Courtney Love reading Kurt's suicide note on live television, but ironically none of the weight of that event hit me till the Spirit video did, and I realized what we'd lost. This live reading defines Courtney for some of those who went through the events chronologically. Reading this seemed to them a commercialization of the death, a way for Courtney to make it about her. But I, having none of the prejudices or experience with Courtney and Kurt prior to that moment, experienced it as an unprecedented act of generosity. Even if my Catholic sensibilities wanted her to sit down and mourn in silence, that letter was to everyone, the fans included, and she shared her pain with us in the same way Live Through This does in all of her songs, as I would find out later. She's an open book, and in some ways cannot experience her life without it being seen, just like the rest of us currently. Pictures or it didn't happen. But she's anything but silent and anything but commercial. What I did experience chronologically went like this. Corporate music media, who it needs to be said had their cash cows slaughtered by Nirvana, first mourned Kurt, then gave Courtney a break for about 30 seconds, then elevated Courtney to Kurt's heir apparent for about a day, and then when she would not play Grateful Rock Star, returned her to the role of undeserving attention whore, and then elevated her again to Hollywood starlet, and then abandoned her again when she would not play Marilyn. She never did get it together long enough to make them happy, or maybe never stopped caring about what they thought enough to be impervious. Too impulsive and unwieldy, unpredictable and outspoken. In other words, too punk. Most of all, too resentful of the pageantry of rock stardom and the media itself to do any of it sincerely. The media does not like you if you criticize it. Ask Elvis Costello, Aaron Sorkin, Tom Petty, Pearl Jam, or any other artist who dared to point a finger at the man behind the reel-to-reel or the camera, even if it was themselves. People's love of Nirvana has led them to project an innocent victim portrait onto Kurt and a psychopathic killer onto Courtney in hindsight, inventing conspiracy theories that Kurt wrote lived through this. According to these, Courtney murdered Kurt and thus disintegrated afterward due to guilt. Only psychopaths and narcissists don't disintegrate from guilt after a murder. A malignant narcissist would kill Kurt because he was breaking up the band and then remain charming and popular, and perhaps start a band where they could finally have the spotlight.
You curl your hair?
You don't like it?
It's nicer when it's straight because it doesn't make your face look so round.
Oh my God!
That's a joke. Courtney made a lot of enemies over the years as Dave grew more likable with every appearance. While Dave racked up the side projects and humorous comedic appearances, Courtney pissed off Dave, Billy Corgan, Trent Reznor, Marilyn Manson, Madonna, Gwen Stefani, possibly Tori Amos, and Billy Corgan again. They called her a starfucker, an attention whore, a slut, a junkie, and more than anything, a liar. They said she trapped Kurt with her baby, got him hooked on heroin, did heroin while she was pregnant, cheated on him, and eventually that she murdered him and made it look like a suicide. Conspiracy theories about it still proliferate on platforms like this. But aren't these theories just the same misogynistic crap we've gotten used to at this point? We'd rather believe Courtney Love was a conniving, murderous psychopath than admit someone we loved would kill themselves in spite of or because of our obsessive, invasive love for them. But more than anything, I think it's denial. All paranoid conspiracy theories are avoiding a truth they cannot swallow. We can't admit Courtney could have written and lived through this, when we'd spent their entire relationship calling her a Yoko and a whore, and that because we couldn't admit she might be better for Kurt than we would. To sell that, we'll bury it under layers of Machiavellian manipulations. She stole his work. She manipulated his every move, trapped him with a baby, and killed him before it could come out. She's a cold-blooded, no-talent, psychopathic Jezebel. Kurt simply had to have written and lived through this.
I just wanted to ask Courtney Love a question. What are you going to do when you run out of all the lyrics Kurt left for you? Oh.
No.
But why? Why is that even a part of it? I'll tell you why. Because Live Through This is the best grunge album. More political than any Pearl Jam, catchier than any Stone Temple Pilots, harder than any Soundgarden, dirtier than any Alice in Chains, and more personal than any Nirvana album besides In Utero, an album written entirely about and with the priceless advice of Courtney Love.
Good. It's so misogynist, especially from a girl. I'm so amazed at this. I mean, if you look at the lyrics from Pretty on the Inside and you look at even...
They sound exactly like Kurt.
Yeah, well, that was 2 years before I met him. And my ego is so big, sweetie. I would never... Why guys like me is because they get to steal from me. Believe, I don't know if this is too intellectual for you at your capacity, but no, seriously, no. Kurt's lyrics, as wonderful as they were really kind of simple and linear, and mine tend to be maybe a little more wordy. And I mean, take it to your English teacher and just compare.
Good guitar player now. Your guitarist Eric was saying that he learned stuff from you.
I have a style, and a lot of the songs are complete Bauhaus ripoffs. With total, and like my guitar playing is totally picked up from Will Sargent and Johnny Marr. It's like referenced from these British bands, and nobody would guess that because of the sort of persona that I've been foisted on me. I mean, I guess now, The guy from Pavement came up to me, he's like, "You're so brave." I'm like, "Why?" He's like, "To cover a Bunnymen song." He's like, "I wouldn't have the nerve." And nobody admits the Bunnymen were the greatest band. Like in my marriage, the compatibility, at one point we were listening to K-Rock, and they were having one of their great flashback weekends, and Kurt was and I was singing every word to The Killing Moon, and Kurt was like, "Man, this music you used to like, it's so romantic."
In the starlit nights I saw you, so cruelly you kissed me. I've been drawn into your magnet trap.
Heart-Shaped Box we know was about Courtney and her umbilical noose. Rape Me is about a type of abuse Courtney had experienced. Frances Farmer, a paranoid schizophrenic, had been abused and mistreated by the press until she had been run out of town and emotionally destroyed. Pennyroyal Tea is an abortifacient mixed by witches. All Apologies is clearly directed at the media.
Yeah, it makes you feel like the kid in school who gets picked on all the time. Or it makes you feel like the school slut.
Kurt Cobain didn't write songs, at least not after Bleach. He wrote albums. Very few of his lyrics after Bleach are linear narratives or even pictures. Each line is often disjointed, painting a picture not with flow of thought, but with the juxtaposition of short images, all orbiting a feeling. Taking the song as a whole, one gets an overall impression. Similarly, each song does not flow into the next in a linear way like, say, a Pink Floyd or Who concept album. The imagery is not contained within a single song, but shattered and scattered throughout every track on the record. Every song has a witch, every song has a baby, every song has an inquisition burning them, even if sometimes it's Kurt. This is Kurt's ode to Courtney, the pregnancy, his unborn daughter Frances, and the ups and downs of a tumultuous relationship while he was being judged and she was under direct attack from 90s entertainment media, the same tabloid news that killed Princess Diana, and that is all that remains of the news today. Much of Courtney's side is often disregarded because we peg Dave Grohl in the figurative divorce as the Paul figure and thus apply to Yoko meets Nancy Spungen role to Courtney. Admittedly, Courtney had cultivated this image, trying out for the role of Nancy in Sid and Nancy, landing a smaller part instead. Two of her largest roles after Kurt died were as the wives and muses of volatile, idiosyncratic public personas. People often over-identify with celebrities who match their own physical type. Every short, skinny blonde white boy I ever met had a Kurt Cobain fixation and cultivated a similar style, particularly if they came from what others might call white trash roots. In the same way, Courtney's resemblance to Nancy may have spurned on a certain imitation. Nancy was a schizophrenic blonde girl in the original punk rock scene who stripped, hooked, and dated Sid Vicious of the Sex Pistols. She had lost oxygen as an infant and never pair bonded with her parents. The press dubbed her Nauseating Nancy for her impulsive outbursts. Sid proceeded to abuse Nancy, do heroin with her, and eventually kill her at the Chelsea Hotel in 1978, stabbing her once to the abdomen. Courtney was a blonde with a similar aesthetic, who also stripped, who also did heroin, who also might have had brain damage from her childhood, and who also maybe had a bit of Sid in her, if we're honest. But I think the press needed a Nancy more than Courtney needed to be her. Yoko Ono is largely blamed for the breakup of the Beatles, driving a wedge between Paul and John specifically, brainwashing him and isolating him from his fellow bandmates, while also being pretty objectively, let's call it an acquired taste, musically. But Sid and the other Sex Pistols were just as nauseating, and while they were spoken of with disdain and excitement by the press, it is Nancy who is spoken of with disdain within the punk community. It is Sid who definitively murdered Nancy, even if while high or in self-defense. The abdominal wound, however, suggests other motivations. We'll never know because Sid OD'd before a trial could take place. And as for Ono, as becomes evident in Peter Jackson's recent Get Back documentary, Yoko Ono did not break up the Beatles. Paul McCartney did.
I always feel as though I'm trying to put you down and stop you playing, but I'm not. I'm trying to stop us all playing until we know what we're playing.
Yeah, but you've got to play in order to find which fits and which doesn't. You see, that's all you can do.
I don't want to say it, but I really just hear myself as being the only one saying it. I want to listen, and I can see if you just sit there like, well, he's saying that one again, is he? And I don't get any support or anything. So I just think, oh, well, fuck it.
Kurt Cobain was a lonely child who bounced between his family homes. His unstable mother and abusive father divorced when he was small at a time when divorce was uncommon and unexpected, causing Kurt to exhibit what we would now recognize as attention-seeking and ADHD behavior, worsened by teenage rebellion and bickering parents. His mother, like many boomers, has many of the symptoms of borderline personality. She could not handle him and sent him to his harsh, abusive father, who remarried to a stepmother who also rejected him. According to his stepmother, Kurt longed to make a family for himself to replace the one he never had. He fell into a crowd of other misfits who stole from a nearby house with a girl who may have been developmentally challenged. While the other kids called her retarded, Kurt only thought of her as quiet and strange. He would later, almost by his account, lose his virginity to her. Either way, rumors spread and Kurt was called retard fucker. He made his first suicide attempt shortly after by laying across train tracks. When the train passed on the tracks next to him instead of the ones he lay across, it spooked him enough to choose life for a while. But I think this demonstrates an extreme rejection sensitivity.
Kurt hated being humiliated. He hated it. he hated it. If he ever thought he was humiliated, then you'd see the rage come out. And so he was also very careful about and stubborn about how the way the art and the work was presented, because he didn't want to be humiliated. I could be humiliated, like I'd humiliate myself or whatever, but not Kurt, no.
Kurt would spend the majority of his 27 years in intermittent stomach pain that often caused him to vomit blood, all from the stress and strain of doing the only thing that made him happy, performing. His cure for that pain would end up being heroin. A similar post-punk figure, Ian Curtis, had killed himself after a lifelong battle with epileptic seizures. The press has never connected lives spent in constant physical pain to drug use or depression, or either man's suicide, and instead always choose the narrative of deviant rock messiahs with loves of death. Courtney Love also never knew a stable home. She was the daughter of a psychotherapist and a road manager for the Grateful Dead, who allegedly dosed her with LSD when she was a toddler. After the divorce, he was not allowed to see Courtney ever again, so she didn't really know her birth father. Her analyst mother sent Courtney to all sorts of therapists as a child, where she was found to have tactile defensiveness and symptoms of autism. She did not speak for most of her childhood and then emerged all at once, or bloomed as she has called it, as the extroverted and shameless stripper and punk rocker. Whether her amateur Tim Leary of a father or her hippie psychotherapist mom, she was more of a patient than a child, implying their narcissism. She spent most of her developmental years in and out of foster care, traveling the world and stripping. She snorted heroin for the first time thinking it was cocaine while stripping in Taiwan, where she'd had to hand over her passport to work. To escape that situation, she had herself deported. She couch-surfed with rock stars, was emancipated, sang for Faith No More until they decided they wanted a male singer, and intermittently stripped for cash, freedom, and anonymity when she found acting to be too much attention. The unspoken implications of this entire life story are molestation, statutory rape, sexual assault, and prostitution, even before we read Courtney's confessional and Sexton-style lyrics. If we must use the Beatles and the Sex Pistols as mirrors and foils to shine light on the story of Nirvana, we must insist on reflecting the truth, not the repeated messianic narrative. We must acknowledge our own jealousy and obsession at the time, the omnipresent eyes of the media and their need to appease us, Kurt's desire for a family, hatred of the public eye, and constant physical pain, and the possibility that Dave Grohl was perhaps taking an increasingly prominent role as Kurt isolated himself. The already lonely Kurt found a kindred spirit with her own pain and a similar childhood who would never judge him and give him what he always wanted, a family. When Howard Stern asked if Stacked Actors by the Foo Fighters was about her, Courtney said all of Dave's songs are
poor
about.
Sam was humiliated. I mean,
All right.
you know, I was in here like being a baby. Dave is on this like mission.
To say that Kurt wrote all your songs.
No, he doesn't do that. He implies it, and which is just even lame enough. But the thing is that he's got yet another song about what a bitch I am. Mm-hmm. I've never written a song about it.
This at first comes off as narcissism, but I don't believe Courtney is a narcissist or a psychopath. A manipulator would be adored by the press and fans. Capitalism is a psychopath's playground, where shallow charm and easy lies rise to the top, untormented and confident. Courtney lacks the emotional control to not say things like this in public and prevent her own persecution, to not take the bait when someone pisses her off. She is angry and impulsive. The BPD type, not the narcissist in a folie à deux. But I don't think she's the borderline either. Even a borderline learns to mask and mirror. This is not to say she doesn't lie, only that she does it on impulse, out of fear, and isn't good at it, just like all of us. And Dave has written at least 3 songs about Courtney. Let's look at those feuds again then, shall we? In light of what we know in 2025. Marilyn Manson abuses young women. Gwen Stefani, Court had contrasted herself with, using Gwen Stefani as a cheerleader example to explain her own lack of popularity and media skills. Gwen took this comparison so personally, she did a pop song with a cheerleader beat as if she had been the subject of the discussion at all. She's now a trad wife who puts ashes on her forehead for her country music star husband and co-funds an anti-abortion app. Where a Bowie could never settle on a persona, Madonna's very ethnicity seems to change with the tides, and she is one of the people who perceives Courtney as histrionic. The Babes in Toyland lead singer Kat Bjelland claims Courtney stole the ruined baby doll look from her, but Courtney was the one who lived and worked behind the scenes in film costume departments, where she salvaged Hollywood gowns tossed for dry rot by the time they had formed the band Sugar Baby Doll together with L7's Jennifer Finch. It seems more likely that the look was invented with them. Inspired by Courtney's interest in fashion, her access to costumes, and the ruined purity of a discarded prom dress that would have appealed to all of them. Of Trent Reznor, Courtney said, "Don't call your band Nine Inch Nails if you have a 3-inch one." This is probably an exaggerated reaction to her rejection, much like the Foo Fighters stuff. Either way, retaliation in the form of the song Starfuckers Inc. is not an unbiased report by a psychologically healthy man with no reason to call Courtney a liar. Certainly none of these future statements reeks of manipulative dishonesty on Courtney's part, only a loudmouth with a sensitivity to rejection. It seems like Courtney lacks exactly the manipulative or deceptive skill of a psychopath or narcissist, to a degree that someone with neurological problems in the area of social skills might. Maybe her parents were a folie à deux, a borderline mother who refused to accept her own imperfections and put Courtney through the analysis ringer, and an antisocial father who tried to fix her with no regard for her rights. Her perceived attention-seeking behavior could be histrionic, but then I remember that she didn't speak for years and then bloomed. A strong sense of justice, an inability to read social cues, and a blunt, sometimes off-putting demeanor. This is just a possibly autism spectrum, anxious person, finding music as an outlet and being forced suddenly into a spotlight they couldn't possibly navigate. The perception of her behavior as attention-seeking is a projection, the kind borderline parents make on their anxious children. The media looks for narratives and latches onto them. Early on, Courtney told them, purely by accident, that she was a Nancy. Kurt was handsome, talented, cool, and self-effacing. His fans hated Courtney as their parents hated Yoko and their daughters hated Kristen Stewart and any other woman attached to the objects of their desires who is not of equivalent appeal to them. Courtney wasn't charming or put together or even elegantly disheveled in a magazine cover way. She was Johnny Rotten in a torn prom dress, wearing her rapes like Stevie Nicks wore her witch hood, both like white ladies come back to avenge their own murders. Perhaps she's Medusa, turned into a monster for the crime of being raped in Athena's temple. Or perhaps she is the Magdalene, who, after washing the feet of Jesus Christ, the church decided was a whore, once it was politically expedient because they had ended the female priesthood. And then they would villainize them as Nyx's witches, the same witches Kurt tries to chastise us for hunting in the form of his pregnant wife.
There's been some pretty extreme things written about us, especially my wife, and she thinks everybody hates her now. So, why don't you give her a message and say, "Courtney, we love you." Okay, ready? On the count of 3. 1, 2, 3.
But Peter was the denier who began that church, and Mary the disciple from whom he stole it. But that's for another video. The point is, by coming out rejecting the virgin archetype, as a woman there was only one left for the public to paint her as. It's cultural Christianity, that phenomenon where an alleged atheist or secular thinker continues to argue from the general premise of the Christian worldview in which they were raised. Most Western thinkers of the last 2 centuries that were not of a completely non-Abrahamic upbringing have a generally Roman worldview as their starting point, even Jews. Patriarchal, imperial, hierarchical, and only interested in the figurative or literal truth or falsity of Yahweh. They likewise inherit the view of all other options as primitive and not even worth talking about from the very Christian perspective they claim to have outgrown. In Jungian and Freudian terms, we continue to think and dream in the archetypes of the Roman interpretation of Jewish allegories, followed by the literalization of those interpretations. We turn all men into messianic martyrs. We turn all women into pristine virgins, dutiful servants, or painted whores. Courtney had the gall to arrive as all 3 in one. Religions made us misogynistic and in need of scapegoats and kings, made us suspicious of women's gifts, dirty from sex and clean from war, till we long for the comforting male approval of the shotgun. If this was the folie à deux narrative we are told, then Courtney would definitely not be the psychopath but the sociopath, not the narcissist but the borderline, not the anxious ADHD partner but the anxious autistic one. Kurt didn't live through this. He empathized with Courtney so much he wrote In Utero. Courtney loved Kurt so much she wrote the best Nirvana album. Not only do we know from neuroscience that confirmation bias multiplies our perception of whatever we are currently thinking about, what we already believe in, and ignores what we don't, creating layers and layers of confirmation bias without our input, but we also know from quantum physics that reality itself is affected by our observation. Electrons behave the way we expect them to, even in our finest, most objective measuring tools. Our reality is constructed by our expectations and beliefs, and in some minute way, each of us lives in an alternate universe. We are part of reality and behave differently when we are watched. Doubly so if that which watches us has the standards and judgmental temperament of a narcissistic parent, and the subject is already borderline from that trauma. Being on television changes people's behavior. Being famous alters our personalities. The observer affects the experiment. Whatever you think of Kurt and Courtney, I want you to take it down to the lowest cluster and ask yourself if you're projecting or exaggerating the traits you see, all while deleting the observer effect. But now imagine the rejection sensitivity of ADHD and the strong sense of justice of autism are present as the media humiliates Kurt and shames Courtney for their personalities and relationship, the only bright spot in lives otherwise filled with rejection, abuse, and mockery. Whether or not it was real, it was not her cheating on him that got him to try to end it again, and succeed a bit later. Our narrative may have been of the Medusa who soiled the temple, the witch with her love hexes on an innocent man, the whore, or the Judas. But to Kurt, Courtney would always be the retarded girl who wasn't retarded, and Kurt the retard fucker, and there was only so long before he'd find another track to lay across. Afterward, Courtney was a goat into which we put our sin, and she had the gall not to die with all of it inside her and absolve us. She had the gall to resurrect, beautiful and unrecognizable. If she'd been a man, we'd have worshipped her for 2,000 years, but she was a woman, so we fast forgot it even happened, gave all the kudos to the men around her, and then called her a whore. See, the media is a borderline personality that becomes the negative space of whatever we want, trying to predict our mercurial moods to survive, which makes us the narcissist, the psychopaths who don't know a mirror when they see one, and so take it for a lover. We let them tell us what we want to hear, feed us what we can't resist, show us what they know we can't look away from, and we love them for it because we only know how to love ourselves. We let them order us to do what we already want to do, to absolve us of our own responsibility. Slowly, our negative qualities amplify. But once the media sees us like they see themselves, the luster wears off. And at the slightest sign of deviation from a reflection, we become enraged. The only place a relationship like this can end is in an explosion.
Do you have any advice for a young girl moving to Hollywood?
I'll get libeled if I say it. Harvey Weinstein invites you to a private party and 4 Seasons stuff.